The little girl waited until Steve Harvey turned away from the family before slipping a folded piece of paper into his hand. She was only 7 years old, and the note was written in uneven pencil, with several words crossed out and rewritten. Steve smiled when he first saw it, expecting a child's drawing or a funny message. But after unfolding the paper, he read the first line and stopped. He read it again. Then his entire expression changed. He looked at the little girl. He looked at her mother. Without saying another word, Steve placed the note on the podium, stood up, and walked off the stage. The audience didn't understand why. The family didn't understand what had happened. Then, nearly 2 minutes later, Steve returned carrying something in his hands that made the little girl burst into tears. Her name was Ava Mitchell. She was 7 years old, and she had been holding the note since 6 o'clock that morning. It was folded into a tiny square and tucked inside the pocket of her pink cardigan. The paper had been torn from a spiral notebook. There was a crooked heart drawn in one corner. Underneath it were several words written in pencil. Ava had written the note 3 times. The first version was too long. The second version made her cry. The third version was the one she brought to the studio. She had not shown it to her mother. She had not shown it to her grandmother. And she had certainly not told the producers, because Ava was afraid that if she said the words out loud, someone would tell her she shouldn't be thinking about them. The Family Feud stage was bright that morning. The audience was excited. The cameras were moving. The families were laughing. Steve Harvey was doing what Steve Harvey did best, making everyone feel comfortable. Ava stood beside her mother, Rachel. She kept looking at Steve, then at the note, then at her mother. Rachel noticed. "You okay, sweetheart?" Ava nodded. "Yes, what are you thinking about?" "Nothing," Rachel smiled. She knew that answer. Ava said nothing whenever something was bothering her. But Rachel didn't push. She had her own secret, a secret that had been breaking her heart for almost a year. Ava's father, Daniel, had died 11 months earlier. He was 35. He had been a construction supervisor. He loved fishing. He loved old movies. And he had a habit of leaving tiny notes for Ava around the house. On the refrigerator, inside her lunchbox, under her pillow. Sometimes they were only 2 words. "Love, Dad." Sometimes they said, "Be brave." Sometimes they were jokes that Ava didn't understand. But she kept every one. After Daniel died, Ava collected them. She put them in a small blue box. Rachel didn't know how important that box had become. Daniel had been sick for several months before he died. At first he complained about being tired. Then he began losing weight. Then came the tests. Then the diagnosis, pancreatic cancer. The doctors explained the treatment. Daniel listened quietly. Rachel cried in the car afterward. Daniel didn't. He looked at her. "We have to keep living." Rachel shook her head. "I don't know how." Daniel took her hand. "Then we'll learn." They had 14 months. 14 months of appointments. 14 months of hospital rooms. 14 months of trying to make ordinary days feel ordinary. Ava was 6 when her father became seriously ill. She didn't understand cancer. She understood that Daddy was tired. She understood that Daddy couldn't carry her anymore. She understood that Mommy cried in the bathroom. But she didn't understand why everyone kept saying, "Be strong." One night, Ava asked Daniel, "Are you going to die?" Daniel looked at her. Rachel was standing in the doorway. Neither parent knew what to say. Daniel finally answered, "Everybody dies someday." Ava started crying. Daniel pulled her close. "But that doesn't mean you stop loving them." Ava asked, "Where do you go?" Daniel smiled. "I don't know. Then how will I find you?" Daniel's eyes filled. "You won't have to." Ava didn't understand. Daniel kissed her forehead. "You'll carry me with you." That was the last serious conversation they had about death. 3 weeks later, Daniel went into the hospital. He never came home. After the funeral, Ava became very quiet. She stopped asking questions. She stopped mentioning heaven. She stopped saying her father's name. Rachel thought she was adjusting. She wasn't. Ava was simply trying to protect her mother. One night, Rachel walked past Ava's bedroom and heard her whispering, "Daddy?" Rachel stopped. Ava was holding one of Daniel's old notes. She whispered, "I didn't forget you." Rachel stood outside the door. She cried silently. A few months later, the family received an invitation to appear on Family Feud. Rachel almost declined, but Ava became excited. Daddy liked Steve. Rachel smiled. "He did. Can we go?" Rachel looked at her daughter. "Okay." Ava jumped up. "Daddy would watch us." Rachel nodded. "I think he would." The night before the taping, Ava opened the blue box. Inside were 19 notes, all written by her father. She spread them across her bedroom floor. One said, "Don't forget your lunch." Another, "Good luck on your test." Another, "I'm proud of you." The last one was written 3 days before Daniel entered the hospital. It said, "Love you more than all the stars." Ava touched the words. Then she took out a fresh piece of paper. She began writing. She stopped. She started again. She cried. She crossed out several sentences. Finally, she wrote, "Steve, please tell my mom I'm okay. She thinks I don't know Daddy is never coming home." Ava folded the paper. She put it in her pocket. The next morning, she carried it to the studio. The game began. Steve joked with the families. Ava laughed. She answered a question. She got it right. Steve gave her a high five. "Look at you." Ava smiled. For a few minutes, she was simply a 7-year-old girl having fun. Then Steve came toward her family. He asked Rachel a question. Rachel answered. Steve joked. Everyone laughed. Ava watched him. Her hand went into her pocket. She touched the note. She almost pulled it out. Then she stopped. A few minutes later, Steve turned toward her. "You've been quiet over there." Ava smiled. Steve pointed. "You got something to say?" Ava nodded. "Can I give you something?" Steve smiled. "Sure." She pulled out the folded paper. Steve took. He laughed. "What's this? A note? For me?" "Yes." Steve smiled. "Well, I better read it." He unfolded the paper. His eyes moved across the first line. His smile disappeared. He read it again. Then he looked at Ava. She was watching him carefully. Steve looked at the note, then back at Ava. He read the last line. His jaw tightened. He slowly placed the note on the podium. The audience was still laughing quietly. They hadn't realized anything had changed. Steve took a breath. He looked toward Rachel. Rachel was confused. What happened? Steve didn't answer. He looked at Ava. Then he stood. He walked away from the podium. The audience became quiet. Steve continued walking. He reached the edge of the stage. Then he walked off. The studio fell completely silent. Rachel stared after him. Ava's eyes filled with tears. "Did I do something wrong?" Rachel immediately hugged her. "No, baby," but he left. "He'll come back." The cameras continued recording. The producers looked confused. A stage manager spoke into a headset. The audience waited. 30 seconds. 1 minute. 90 seconds. Steve was gone. Ava looked down. "I shouldn't have given him the note." Rachel held her tighter. "You did nothing wrong." Then Steve came back, but he wasn't holding the cards. He wasn't smiling. He was carrying a small wooden box. He walked slowly onto the stage. The audience became completely silent. Steve stopped in front of Ava. He knelt. "Is this yours?" Ava stared at the box. She recognized it immediately. Her eyes widened. "My daddy's box." Steve nodded. "I know." Ava looked at Rachel. Rachel looked stunned. Steve explained. "I read your note." Ava nodded. Steve held the box carefully. "You said your mom thinks you don't know your daddy isn't coming home." Ava's lip trembled. Steve continued. "And you said you were pretending to be okay because you didn't want her to cry." Ava nodded. Steve's eyes filled. Then he said, "Baby, that's not your job." Ava started crying. Steve placed the box on the floor. "Your job is to be 7." Ava wiped her eyes. Steve continued. "You're supposed to laugh. You're supposed to play. You're supposed to ask a million questions. You're supposed to make a mess." The audience began crying. Steve pointed gently toward Rachel. "Your mama's job is to be the grown-up." Rachel covered her face. Steve stood and walked toward her. "Let her be the grown-up." Rachel nodded through tears. Steve turned back to Ava. "You don't have to protect her from missing your daddy," Ava whispered, "but she cries." Steve nodded. "Adults cry too." Ava looked at him. "Even you?" Steve smiled, "Especially me." The audience laughed softly through their tears. Steve picked up the note. "Can I read something from your note?" Ava nodded. Steve looked at the paper. "You wrote, 'Please tell my mom I'm okay.'" He looked at Rachel. "She needs to hear something from you." Ava walked toward her mother. Rachel knelt. Ava wrapped her arms around her. "I miss Daddy." Rachel began crying. I know you miss him too." Rachel nodded. Ava continued. "But I'm okay." Rachel held her tightly. "You don't have to be okay all the time." Ava nodded. Then Rachel whispered, "Neither do you." The audience began applauding. Steve stood a few feet away. He wiped his eyes. Then he looked at the producer. "We're stopping the game." The audience fell silent. Steve placed his cards on the podium. No more questions. He looked at Rachel. No more pressure. Then he looked at Ava. "Today we're going to remember your daddy." Ava nodded. Steve asked, "What was his name?" "Daniel." Steve smiled. "Daniel." He repeated the name. Then he asked, "What did he love?" Ava thought. "Fishing." Steve smiled. "Anything else?" "Me." Steve laughed. "That sounds right." Ava smiled. "And Mommy." Rachel cried again. Steve looked at her. "Sounds like a good man." He was. Steve nodded. Then he looked toward the audience. "Everybody needs to remember something." He pointed toward Ava. "This little girl has been trying to carry grief like it's a grown-up job." He shook his head. "It isn't." He looked toward Rachel. "And this mother has been trying to be strong enough for everybody." He paused. "She doesn't have to be." Steve walked toward the center of the stage. Then he asked the audience to stand. Everyone stood. Steve looked at Ava. "Do you know what your daddy wrote in those notes?" Ava shook her head. Steve held up the final note. "He wrote that he loved you more than all the stars." Ava burst into tears. Rachel hugged her. Steve placed the note back into the box. Then he said, "Then that's what we're going to remember." The audience stood silently. No applause, no music, just silence. Steve looked at the camera. "For anybody watching this who has lost somebody," he paused, "don't be afraid to say their name." He looked at Ava. "Daniel." Then he looked at Rachel. "Daniel." Rachel nodded. The audience repeated softly, "Daniel." Ava smiled through tears. Steve knelt again. "You hear that?" Ava nodded. "Your daddy's name is still being said." She smiled. "He would like that." Steve nodded. "I think he would." Then Steve did something completely unexpected. He reached into his jacket. He pulled out a small card. I had something made backstage. He handed it to Ava. She opened it. Inside was a simple message for Ava: keep laughing, keep asking questions, keep loving your daddy. At the bottom was Steve's signature. Ava hugged the card. Thank you. Steve smiled. You're welcome. Then he turned toward Rachel. I want to help with something else. He explained that he wanted to establish an education fund for Ava, not because she had lost her father, but because Daniel had been a father who wanted his daughter to have a future. Steve called his team. He arranged for $40,000 to be placed into an education account for Ava. Rachel immediately shook her head. Steve, I can't accept that. Steve smiled. You can, but your daughter is going to college. Rachel laughed through her tears. She wants to be a veterinarian. Steve looked at Ava. You want to be a veterinarian? Ava nodded. I like animals. Steve smiled. Then that's what we're doing. The audience applauded. Then something else happened. The opposing family stepped forward. Their captain, Linda, spoke. We'd like to give our prize money too. Rachel looked shocked. Steve looked at them. You don't have to. Linda shook her head. We know. She smiled. We want to. The audience erupted. Steve nodded. That's family. The game was never finished. There was no final round. There was no winner. There was no loser. The episode ended with both families standing together. Ava held the wooden box. Rachel held her daughter, and Steve stood beside them. Before they left the stage, Steve asked Ava one final question. What's the first thing you're going to do when you get home? Ava thought. Make pancakes. Steve laughed. Why pancakes? My daddy made them. Steve nodded. Then make a big stack. Ava smiled. How big? Steve held his hands apart. Bigger than this. She laughed. And that was the first genuine laugh of the afternoon. 3 weeks later, the episode aired. The clip of Steve reading the note spread quickly. People didn't know what the note said at first. They only saw Steve's expression. They saw him walk away. They saw him return carrying the wooden box. Within 48 hours, millions of people had watched it. Then the full story came out. The line that stayed with viewers was simple. Your job is to be 7. Parents shared it. Teachers shared it. Grief counselors shared it. People who had lost parents when they were children wrote about the burden they had carried. One woman wrote, I was 9 when my father died. I spent years pretending I was okay because I thought my mother needed me to be strong. I wish someone had told me I was allowed to be a child. Another wrote, my daughter lost her father last year. This made me cry because she does the exact same thing. A few months later, Rachel began grief counseling. So did Ava. For the first time, Ava was allowed to talk openly about Daniel. She could say, I miss Daddy. She could ask, why did he die? She could cry. She could laugh. She could look at photographs. She could remember. The blue box became part of their family routine. Every Sunday they opened it. They read one note. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they cried. But they always said Daniel's name. 1 year later, Ava returned to the studio. She was 8 now. She walked onto the stage holding something. Steve saw her. Look at you. Ava smiled. I brought something. Steve laughed. What is it this time? Ava held up a photograph. It showed her Rachel and a framed photograph of Daniel at the kitchen table. They were making pancakes. Steve smiled. That's beautiful. Ava nodded. We made Daddy's pancakes. How were they? Ava made a face. Terrible. Steve burst out laughing. That's how you know you did it right. Ava laughed. Then she handed him a small envelope. Steve looked at it. Another note? Yes, he opened it. It said, "Thank you for telling me I could be a kid." Steve became quiet. He looked at Ava. Then he hugged her. The audience applauded. Ava whispered, "I'm still 7 sometimes." Steve laughed. "Good, then," he said, "stay 7 as long as you can." Years later, Ava would remember that day for a different reason. Not because Steve Harvey was famous, not because the game was canceled, not because people cried. She remembered it because that was the day someone finally told her something she desperately needed to hear. Her father's death was not her responsibility. Her mother's sadness was not her responsibility. And being strong every second was not her responsibility. She was allowed to be a child. She was allowed to miss her father. She was allowed to laugh without feeling guilty. She was allowed to have a future. The note that had started everything eventually went into the blue box. Ava kept it. The paper was slightly wrinkled. The pencil had faded. But the words remained. "Please tell my mom I'm okay." Years later, Ava would add another sentence underneath it. "Mom is okay too." And beneath that, "We're still talking about Dad." Because grief doesn't disappear. It changes. At first, it feels like something that takes up the whole room. Then one day, you realize it has become a smaller piece of the room. Still there, still important, but no longer everything. Ava learned that. Rachel learned it too. And perhaps the most beautiful part of the story was that Steve never actually fixed anything. He couldn't bring Daniel back. He couldn't remove the pain. He couldn't promise that Ava would never cry again. What he did was much simpler. He saw a little girl carrying something too heavy. He put down the cards. He walked off the stage. And when he came back, he reminded her that she didn't have to carry it alone. Sometimes that's what kindness looks like. Not solving someone's grief, just noticing it. Not giving someone all the answers, just telling them they are allowed to ask the questions. Not making the pain disappear. Just standing beside them while they feel it. And sometimes, the most powerful thing an adult can say to a grieving child is only this: "You don't have to be strong for me. You're allowed to be a kid." And for Ava, those words became the beginning of something she had almost forgotten was possible. A childhood. If this story about Ava's note and Steve's unexpected reaction touched your heart, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who has lost a parent or someone who is quietly carrying grief. Have you ever had to be strong when you were still just a child? Tell us your story in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more emotional stories about family, love, loss, and the moments that remind us that nobody should have to carry their pain alone.